Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Nick Brown. I'm the COO for Communication and Outreach at the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. And I'm here with my very special, wonderful colleague, Michelle Hamiel, who is the COO for Public Services. Welcome, Michelle.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Nick. I'm glad you're joining me tonight.
Yeah,
They're Kyla and I just go back and forth, Nick. So you have to be Kyla tonight.
I will stand in. I can't do the Canadian accent, though. But we miss Kyla today. She's not able to be with us, but I'm here to stand in for you all. And if you didn't know it, this is the Elephant We Don't See, a Diversity Dialogue, a monthly series that the Prince George's County Memorial Library System and Prince George's County Office of Human Rights have presented since year one of COVID. We're almost, it feels like year three. Come up, who knows what's going on. But we have been, throughout this whole pandemic, getting through some really meaningful conversations in this series and hoping to broaden the tent and bring more people into these discussions where we can reflect on the journeys of others in order to be more self-aware and in order to better show up in the community to make sure that we are proactively trying to combat racism and exclusion and prejudice and discrimination. And this is an ongoing continuum, which unfortunately a book club will not ever be the solution to, but this is part of creating an environment and conditions in which we hope that there will be some progress for everyone who has suffered at the hands of discrimination or violence. So today, Coming of Age in Mississippi by Moody. Does anyone out there know Anne's original name, birth certificate name that then got changed later on from some weirdness that happened with the local government? Give it 3 seconds. I would say Jeopardy music, but Jeopardy's now controversial. It's true. So her original first name was Essie Mae, and then there was a weird snafu later on where it got changed to Annie, and then she stuck with that. So I figured maybe we start off with a little overview of what happens in the book and who Anne was, and then we can dive into the subjects that she's tackling. So I first read this book about a year ago and then refreshed a little bit for today. And to me, if you look at the cover, it says the classic autobiography of growing up poor and Black in the rural South. And the book first came out in 1968 and really helped launch Anne's profile as a member of the civil rights movement and one of the few Black women leaders who were recognized at the public kind of pop culture level, and it was in large part because of her book and some of the connections that she had in the movement. It goes through her journey in childhood with kind of, there's birth through up to high school, then there's high school, and then there's her time in college, and then she briefly covers some of the early years of her time in the movement. And then that's where we end. And it's kind of, I haven't read many books written in this period of the late 60s, so it's kind of, you have to refresh that a lot of things happened later on. So for example, the events of 1968 are not covered in this book at all, because it was published in 68, which means the writing was completed before that. So the awful things that happened with the assassinations and Dr. Martin Luther King, and then the riots, and then to this day in cities like Washington, D.C., we still see the effects of that unrest from 1968. And this is very much a relic of a moment in time preceding that 1968 flashpoint from the mid-40s into the mid-60s. And that's my sense of the overview of kind of the structure of it. Did you have any other impressions of it?
I just wanted to add something that I don't think people think too much about, Nick, is most of the people who were in the forefront of the civil rights movements were middle class. They didn't have the struggles that Essie Mae had. Very few people came from poor rural South. She was the child of sharecroppers, and it was truly she was poor, and her mother and her father tried to stifle her because it was not safe for her to speak up and speak out. And she was a bold little girl. And when I say they were poor, they were poor. And I don't think people, even people who are considered disenfranchised now, would not understand where she came from. And to achieve well, first of all, even to just write a book. I was reading something that talked about this is considered a narrative. And when I can't remember who it was, whatever article I read said that they were surprised by the writing because it was a narrative. And this young woman coming from rural South, it was not expected to be written so well. It is also a work that is still used in college courses today. And that is also rare. Um, and the other thing that I said is that I think about is it is a shame that much of what because there are some dynamic quotes, but many of them still hold true today. So, 1968, we're talking almost 60 years, almost 60 years. So, what is it? 50, 43 years. And um, the quotes are relevant today.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Um, I had I was telling you earlier that I had an interesting conversation with a gentleman who works with us, a colleague. And I won't say his name because he may not want me telling this story, but he's from Florence, uh, South Carolina. And for those of you who don't know, Florence is below Myrtle Beach. And I was saying to him, I said, I think I drove through Florence going to Myrtle Beach. And he said, Nah, you didn't. You may have seen signs, but you didn't drive through. So, anyway, he just started talking about where he was from. And he is an older gentleman. And I love talking to him. He stops in my office every afternoon, and we usually chit chat about something. It was just timely that he started talking about he had just come back from visiting home, which was Florence, South Carolina. And he um, shared with me that as when he was younger, he was not allowed to go to Myrtle Beach. And he said all of the African Americans had to go to Atlantic Beach. And he said, but those days, he said, a lot of people don't want to talk about them. He said, but those days weren't so bad. He said, we knew our place. We knew what we could do and what we couldn't do. And those things that we couldn't do, we didn't do. He said, and I felt safer then than I do today. He said, because the same stuff is going on. It's just that who's doing it hides. He said, they didn't hide. He said, they might put some stuff on so you couldn't see who they were. But you still knew what to expect. He said, you just don't know what to expect today. And he talked about, when things were segregated, he said it just felt like it was better to him. And, I've heard my mother will be 85 next month. Well, this month, September. And she said the same thing that she thought things were better. She and this gentleman said that they thought the schools were better, that the education was better, and you know, it's troublesome that here we are when we think we've arrived, and everything that Essie May fought for, um, we're still fighting for voters' rights. We're still fighting against voter suppression. We are still fighting the same fight. So as I started to read this, I was in a funky space anyway, and I started reading this, and it was just um, a reminder that this fight is continuous. And um, then I started thinking about all of the people who've gone before us, many of them who are now passing away, um, who fought this fight. And yet, this book is still too timely. So, um, really a interesting read. And the fact that it's written by a female is also a different perspective, because there are lots of females who were civil rights leaders, um, but the ones who are in the forefront are usually the males. So um, I was um, really intrigued by this book, and um, there's some interesting quotes in the book, as I think you mentioned. Well, you and I were talking about it earlier. Um, but I also wanted to mention she came from a, I'm going to say, an abusive household, only because it was her brother who was 8 years old who was abusing her and her sister. Um, and that was troublesome to me. But it was a product. I mean, she was a product of I mean, she was a child of sharecroppers. And so they had to go out and work the field, and the parents did the best that they could. An 8-year-old got to watch the babies, and he took advantage of them because he didn't want to watch them.
Yeah, I think there's for me kind of two distinct but connected sections to this book, where it's divided in those categories that I mentioned before, but there's like the first person narrative of conditions in the life of someone at this social status and in this specific geography and as a Black sharecropping family at that time in this country. And then there is the latter part where it's like, okay, she wasn't having any of that. So what did she do as she was coming of age to prepare herself and steel herself to be a leader in the movement? So you've got, you see this, there's episodes from when she's working as domestic staff in a white household, where she's eventually learning how to stand up for herself at great risk to herself, but she develops that voice for her as someone who just can't tolerate injustice. And then we see when she's in college, she led a boycott, and there were conditions where the colleges that she went to were Natchez College, which was a junior college, and then Tougaloo College. And when she went to the junior college, the women were separated, which, yes, this was still a time with a lot of gender separation, everyone. And there were significant qualitative differences in the experience of the men that were going to the school versus what they were calling the women's auxiliary. And at this time, Anne is a total rabble-rouser and led a boycott because she had been getting basically abused verbally by the matron in charge of the women's auxiliary dorm. And the food that they were being given was subpar and had maggots in it and things like that. And Anne got to the point where she staged a boycott for the whole campus and involved the president and things like that. But you see in this journey of her coming of age, what she lived through, what were the conditions that caused her to refuse to be kind of the victim of her circumstance, and then see how that graduated into being a member of the movement and leading, organizing at times in the Deep South and the Delta specifically, where there's this really important quote that I'd love to pull out that talks about, what it meant to be a Black person in that time, in that area, who was an organizer, and the great risks that created. So she couldn't even go home at a certain point because literally her family would be killed and she would probably be killed too. So this is on page 292 if you've got my edition, but and this is all a quote. "But it hurt to have my family prove to me how scared they were. It hurt me more than anything else. I knew the whites had already started the threats and intimidations. I was the first Negro from my hometown who had openly demonstrated, worked with the NAACP, or anything. When Negroes threatened to do anything in Centerville, they were either shot, like Samuel O'Quinn, or run out of town, like Reverend Dupree." And she goes on to talk about how even her sending a letter to her mother was putting her family at risk because of who might intercept that. And then it put her mother in the position of having to respond, which could also get intercepted. And then on that same page, and this was kind of an important reminder for us since we work in libraries, she's talking then about some sit-ins and demonstrations and lists some of the conditions that the movement was trying to get improved in that moment. And one of them was integration of public parks and libraries. And for folks who do not know the history of libraries, libraries in most of this country were segregated until very recently. And in many libraries, the effects of that culture still are pervasive. And that's across the country. Doesn't matter, north, south, Midwest, west, whatever else. And you know, we were talking about earlier the way that this history gets lost, right? So even Anne Moody's book, like this book, 70s, 80s, was a book that was in the standard canon if you were doing Black studies. It's still in that for the people who are studying this period, but it's not as widely known anymore. You had someone like Ted Kennedy at his prime running for president, doing one of the cover blurbs. Like that kind of indicates that she was plugged in the circles of politics and stuff. And this is, while just one account from this time period, I think it's a really interesting one and a valuable one to consider in the overall scope of things. But maybe Michelle, do you want to shift to talking about how history doesn't get passed down and how important that is?
Well, that's what I was going to say. So I think people have this misnomer that post-Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation is signed and African Americans were set free. And just want to remind folks, we didn't get our 40 acres and a mule. But we also didn't have established families necessarily, because husbands and wives had been sold off, children had been sold off. And if you were not going to stay behind and do sharecropping, or if the white slave owner wasn't going to let you stay on the property, you had to leave the property. And keep in mind, nobody's embracing the African Americans who are now trying to survive. And now most of them are trying to move north or trying to find a piece of land. Many were not educated. And I think that we forget what it must have taken for me to be where I am today, and many like me. And I grew up in a predominantly Jewish community, Orthodox Jewish community. And one of the things that I learned early on is that they share their history. Many of their holidays are around remembering their history. And African Americans, for whatever reason, because our history is not something that we want to celebrate because it doesn't feel good, we don't share it. And I think that our children have lost, it's not going to be taught in school, and our children have lost a part of who they are. And it's hard to be proud of where you come from if you don't know it. And that's why it's important to read books like this one to truly get an understanding of where this woman came from. One of my favorite books, and I'm jumping, I know, to it's by one of my favorite authors is J. California Cooper, and she wrote a book entitled "The Wake of the Wind." And without telling the whole story, she's sitting on the porch, and her husband wonders how our kids going to know what we've been through. And she said, because we will tell our story. And that is what I struggle with. We don't have many people telling our story, and we don't have people talking about, other than maybe someone like us, Nick, who've decided that this is a book we need to read and discuss. And because who's pulling out a book from 1968 and saying, let's read it? And when we don't share this knowledge, it's lost, and people can easily say it didn't exist. But the other thing that can happen is history can repeat itself, and that is scary.
Yep. And history, unfortunately, repeats itself daily all over the world. And even if we just think about, I can't believe we're still in the same year as the January 6th thing.
Mhm.
But like just thinking about this year as separate from last year, which it's not, of course, everything from this year was informed by conditions of last year and the last 400 years. Um, we, in the way that we lead our lives, at least in this culture, we're so focused about the hustle in the moment. And it's like there are blinders to everything past. And like, even if we were to have the greatest education system, the best curricula that actually is representative of what has happened and shares different perspectives and things, with our current attention spans and people's focus on self and whatever else they're focusing on, we're not looking back. We don't live as a society as if we're students of history. And if we were, I think we could think about something that would be more provocative that comes up once in a while, of like scrutinizing the figures that we idolize in this culture. And this is not about Confederates. This is about on the Union side. This is on the American Revolution. Like, we have all these deified figures, George Washington being one of them, who, yes, they did many great things, but that doesn't absolve the many bad things that they did. And Jefferson, of course, is one who's been getting more scrutiny than others, but I mean, everyone back then was. And what is the legacy of that? Who are their descendants, and what are they doing? This is like a total segue, but the Sackler family situation, like the challenges that existed at any point in time in our history, there are generations and generations of implications. And one of the books that we've addressed at the library and with Office of Human Rights this year that is, I think, applicable to this conversation is Clint Smith's new book, because he goes to various places in our country and sees like why are millennials going to get married on plantations and celebrating that? Like, what is this complete and utter disregard for the history that is very, very recent in the grand scheme of things? But if it didn't happen since July 4th, like, nobody's paying attention to it.
Right.
And it's troubling. And one question that I would throw out, and we'd love to have comments from the audience at any point. Feel free to put them in there, and we'll bring into the conversation. Is how do we all approach keeping the history in mind on a daily basis, knowing that the realities of our attention spans are such that we're not that thoughtful as a species, and that kind of sucks. Excuse the French, but I don't know. That's where I'm at.
So one of the things that you reminded me of, my father, um, there were certain things he would get stuck. I will be the first to tell you, my father would get stuck. But there were certain things that he just would not do. So, for example, he would he was never going to go to Ocean City. Now, his family was from the Eastern Shore. They lived in my and he was not allowed. African Americans were not allowed in Ocean City, and it would have killed him to go to Ocean City. I was not allowed to go.
Wow.
And we could go some other Atlantic City when I was little. We went to Wildwood when I was little. We were not allowed to go to Ocean City. There were some restaurants that my father said absolutely not. We're not eating in. But he told me the history behind it.
Yeah.
And I understood it. But that doesn't happen today. I have some restaurants I'm not going to eat in now. But I got that from my father. So it just is a reminder that, and I'm not saying, all African Americans shouldn't eat at certain restaurants or shouldn't go certain places. But the reason some places were able to thrive and have some of the systemic racism that exists is because no one called them on it. And when they decided that it was okay to let us spend our money there, we would decide to patronize. And I just think that we just need to share our history. Just let people know, okay, see this place over here? Not so long ago, you weren't allowed to, you would
Yeah,
not have been allowed to go there.
yeah,
And you're right. You know, all of the hotels, resorts built on plantations. We can't wait to go. You know,
yeah,
some can't wait to
yeah.
go. Yeah.
Um, another an example of this that was striking to me of a place that I visited I'm glad I was able to learn something from the experience. Was I went to visit um, the Civil War battlefield site in I think it's Fredericksburg,
Hmm.
and it's a National Park Service site, and the visitor center used to be segregated, and I would have never known that, but National Park Service put a giant exhibit display front and center outside the building so that you could not walk into that space without having to confront the fact that our country is screwed up. And like that, that might be too forward for a lot of people, especially people who are not as comfortable scrutinizing their role in race relations. But I would have never come across that history of that physical space had they not done that very intentional thing as interpreting the history. And I thought that was just an example of curatorial people doing something intentionally that worked for me, at least in terms of it made me recognize and understand something that had happened. And that we're not talking about very long ago. That's that's the 60s, and I'm sure even way later than that. And then the worst thing, as I'm learning this, it was a crazy vehicle parade day. This was last year, so it was pre-election. So it was one of those crazy vehicle parades that were going through a lot of towns with all the flags and things like that for certain candidates or other. And literally that was going by me as I'm like reading this history. I was like, this is shocking. And when we think about, oh, well, DC area, super liberal, progressive, nope.
Yeah.
We have some comments in the chat from Michelle Robinson. And first one was, I appreciate you saying that those things are not mutually exclusive. The historical leaders that are revered were not necessarily good people as it relates to the history of this country. Going back a few minutes, so thank you for that. And then Mount Vernon, George Washington's home, also acknowledges the presence of enslaved people that often gets whitewashed out of history. Thank you for bringing that to light too. And another place along those lines that's at least been putting some effort in is Monticello and elevating the stories of the people who were enslaved on those grounds who, made it possible for Jefferson's aura to expand and such. Here's another comment coming in. Susan says, one thing that helps with my short attention span is the books you recommend. They give me a chance to spend hours at a time in the worlds of other people. Well, thank you, Susan. I think that means we've done our job.
I was
We
going
can
to
go
say
home now.
that is the whole purpose.
Yes.
Every time I think that, okay, people are sick of this, then you get a comment like that and say, okay, one more month.
Yeah. And, one of the things that we tried to do with this series intentionally, with great thanks to Michelle and Kyla, is that we wanted to bring different lived experiences into the books that were selected for 2021. And I think the range has been really interesting, and it's helped us see some similarities in conditions and issues that different communities face at the same time, and oftentimes in isolation from each other. But there are some very clear connections in some points. So,
you know what I find interesting though, Nick? So there are all those similarities, but even within, if we realized all of our similarities, and because all the different groups that we've read about, there aren't any necessarily, the connections aren't there between us. It would be like if we all could just band together, but we discriminate between the groups.
Yep.
And all of the stories, you could just change the names, change the color of the skin, change the human condition, change the humanness, I guess is and you wouldn't know that there was any differences. That it just But we don't do that. So what's
Yeah.
wrong? How do we change that? Can we change that?
I certainly have no answers to that quandary. I have my personal thoughts about it, but so grain of salt with everything that I'm going to say. I This question troubles me frequently, and I get really sad when different people who are experiencing discrimination for different reasons, like don't stand up for each other. And the thing that I come back to, which is probably an oversimplification, is that humans are tribal, and we are a species, and we kind of, I think, survival is so hard for so many people that our energy is so expended on trying to take care of ourselves and our immediate circles and our immediate communities that it's hard to lend some of that space to people, whether they're Afghan refugees, people who are in a different ethnic community that live locally that don't speak English, or in the LGBTQ plus community, or they live with a disability, or any other reason. And there, it's unfortunate because there is a limit to how much each individual can do to
Mm-hmm.
kind of advance change. And for a lot of people, I think, especially in the last year and a half, when these extreme flashpoints have been happening in terms of adding urgency to the issues that should be urgent and had not been for a long time, seeing that some people choose to remain ignorant, that's one factor that's happening. I
Mm-hmm.
think other people across community groups have had to deal with this their whole lives and
Mm-hmm.
are so beaten down by the circumstances that it's a lot for anyone else to expect them to carry on this fight. And it's individual choice, right, to determine how much you're going to participate as someone who's pushing for change. But I think in the moments, if we look at the history of the civil rights movement in our country, and even if we're going back to like suffrage forward,
Mm-hmm.
the little moments of hope have always been, I think, when there have been the strongest coalitions across different groups. So if we think
Mm-hmm.
about the March on Washington, that was a whole lot of different things coming together, a whole lot of different
Mm-hmm.
movements. You had crunchy white liberals from Vermont coming together with migrant farm workers from Mexico who are working in the Southwest to African Americans from the South and the North and such. And
Mm-hmm.
the election of certain politicians is the same deal. It's coalitions of different people understanding the benefit of a single common pursuit to then be able to expand to address the different issues that affect each of them. But I think those moments are unfortunately really rare, and it's hard to sustain them.
I was going to say, but what has to happen? I mean, because there are only so many times in history that that happens. So what is it that sparks it?
Yeah.
Because um, after Freddie Gray, there's a movement, but it's died down.
Mhm.
Um, and yes, there's interest in equity, diversity, and inclusion um, all over the country in many different organizations. And but how long before it dies down? Um, how do you keep that energy? And the other thing that I was thinking about, we probably wouldn't have any of these issues if we could actually eliminate poverty.
Mhm.
Um, because really at you know, that's where the different, it sounds like I'm on a communist society almost, but I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
You know, if you don't have anybody to oppress, because we all are on equal playing fields, it wouldn't matter whether,
Yeah.
skin looked different or you liked something different or none of our differences would matter if we were all on the same playing field
Yeah.
and all had access to the same resources and
Hmm.
um or we were willing to share when we found out about a resource.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
just, yeah, yeah.
I think that's a really um, important point in this. And sadly, our country was founded on the like maintaining the superiority of a certain class of wealth by a certain flavor of human who came like or originated in a certain place, and all of that status was dependent on the subjugation of everyone else around them, including their white wives, including their children who were girls, including the boys until they came of age and that kind of thing. And then of course the enslaved people and the indigenous people who were disenfranchised in that, and continue to be disenfranchised in that. I agree. I think there's, if implemented well, um, equity and making sure that everyone has the supports that they need so that there is a level playing field, but that means that the supports will look different for different groups,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
And that's what this work is all about. One of the things that's coming to mind as picking up on your comment thread, on going back to the Freddie Gray and then how things have died out. One of the things that comes up in the LGBTQ plus community, and that has, I know, come up as well with Black Lives Matter, is what does it mean when corporations start touting the slogans and selling merch and profiting off of this? And what are the good elements of that? And what are the bad elements? Yes, it's a big deal for MLB to pull the All-Star game from Atlanta because of voter disenfranchisement. Was that the right decision? Everyone's going to be entitled to an individual opinion on that. But at the very least, MLB made a statement. But
Right.
another example is like at the Pride Parade, the hotel chain is showing up. That's marketing. They're trying to get the LGBTQ people to come spend money on
Spend
them.
money,
And
right.
yes, hopefully that means that they're inclusive. But you see, there's a flagship airline in this country that gives a lot of money to politicians who literally are trying to take the rights away from the LGBTQ employees who then they celebrate with their Pride Month celebrations. And that's within the same company. And so like what is that? I don't know, it's just like a total cognitive dissonance
Mhm,
that
mhm,
exists in our society, and where it's like
mhm.
capitalism and money drive everything, and like corporations moving into the space of equity, and on the one hand, yes, corporations getting into the space are part of moving the needle longer term.
Mhm.
Um, but what are their motives?
I was gonna
Yeah,
say, and
yeah,
what do their policies say?
yeah.
Because many of the corporate policies will say that your hair can't look a certain way. You can't, in some corporations, if you're gonna make it to the director or CFO or chief, COO, CFO, any of the C's or directors, your hair, you can't have your hair can't be a certain style.
Mhm.
Dreads aren't gonna make it. Um, you African American men are usually have facial hair. And well, some corporations you might not make it. You might have to shave your beard off. But my guess is the um, the policy might change if you showed up in that particular organization. And oh well, well he's okay. He can keep his beard. Um, and Miss Vivian's asking a question, how old was the girl in the book? She starts off as a child, and she actually, it is coming of age. So she grows up, she goes through college and into the civil rights movement. So let's see, let's see, at the beginning, because I think the book goes to 1964, Nick. Is that right?
Think about that. She was born in 1940.
Okay.
So I think basically up to her mid-20s.
So getting back to that book, thank you, Miss Viv. This book, thank you, Miss Vivian.
So you're like, bring it back.
Nick and I do this even in the office.
I
So,
know. It's good. We enjoy it.
um, one of the things that I wanted to talk about is how bold she was, because growing up in rural Mississippi, um, where most people were afraid to buck the system, when her mother told her don't talk about certain things, um, where people were being lynched, there was a family whose house was set on fire, and um, they're watching all of this. She was willing to speak up, speak out, but because of it, she couldn't visit home, like we mentioned. And imagine her mother. First of all, this was not the norm. And here she goes off to college and she's going to fight for the rights of, well, there were lots of rights she was fighting for. And to be so outspoken, to be an African American female, her mother probably lived in fear every single day. And um, she had, most people, when you get afraid, there's some close family member that you want to turn to help get you through that moment. She couldn't do that. She was in that alone. That fight. I mean, she just the courage, um, the bravado, the she was just so courageous to speak up. And there's in the book, so Emmet Till, she hears about Emmet Till, and her mother tells her she's going to the white family's home, where she worked, and her mother tells her, do not, because she has some mother about it. Did you hear about the boy who was killed? And her mother told her, do not talk about it. You shouldn't even heard it. You should not have heard about it. Don't you talk about it. And she's scared to death when the woman she works for, let me see, got some pages marked here, asked her about her hearing about it. So, like, I mean, she did listen to her mother this time, and she said that she didn't know anything about it. And this woman tells her, he was killed because he got out of his place with a white woman. A boy from Mississippi would have known better than that. This boy was from Chicago. Negroes up north have no respect for people. They think they can get away with anything. He just came to Mississippi and put a whole lot of notions in the boys' heads here and stirred up a lot of trouble, she said passionately. And then she asked Essie, how old are you? And she says she was 14. She would be 15 soon. And she reminded her that that boy who was killed was 14 too. Um, and said it's a shame he had to die so soon. That was one time that she held on to her thoughts. And she said she went home shaking like a leaf on a tree. She said, for the first time out of all her trying, Mrs. Burke had made me feel like rotten garbage. So this woman had really been kind to her up until then.
Mhm.
And that just let her know her position. And to feel like um, rotten garbage. She says many times she had tried to instill fear within me and subdue me and had given up. But when she talked about Emmet Till, there was something in her voice that sent chills and fear all over me. Um, and her mother probably was more fearful than Essie because her mother really had experienced more. And then her daughter goes off to college to fight this fight.
Yeah,
And
there's a point that she very frequently is talking about the mother's fear. And there's one point later on in the book, I think this is in the college section, where the mother tells her the local sheriff came by and was questioning what the daughter's activities, even though she wasn't even near there at the time. But like, I mean, I can't imagine that. You know, the sheriff showing up, like basically throwing a warning shot out of like, better, like, what is going on here? You're a target. Like at that point, you're already a target. And I think just imagining like what trauma that family went through, and Anne was strong enough in her own being that she seemed to not be sidetracked by her fear. Like I think she was so bold and courageous, at least in the way that she tells it, that she wasn't phased by it in the same way that her mother was, for sure.
Yeah, and this kind of, she kind of describes her fear. She said, before Emmet Till's murder, I had known the fear of hunger, hell, and the devil. But now there was a new fear known to me, the fear of being killed just because I was Black. So until she was 15, she didn't know the fear of being killed simply because of the color of her skin. She said, this was the worst of my fears. I knew once I got food, the fear of starving to death would leave. I also was told that if I were a good girl, I would not have to fear the devil or hell. But I didn't know what one had to do or not do as a Negro not to be killed. Probably just being a Negro, period, was enough. And yet she decided to fight. I don't know. I try to place myself in. I'm kind of strange because when I read books like this, I do try to place myself in their shoes, and and I imagine myself at 15. I cannot imagine at 15 hearing about Emmet Till and knowing we're the same age, and then having the reality that I could be killed simply because of the color of my skin, and hearing everything that my mother has told me up to that point, and telling me these things to try to keep me safe. And then I go on to be that bold and courageous and a risk taker. I don't know that I don't know. I don't know. I'm glad she did. I don't know that I could have done that.
Yeah.
And I don't know what was in her to make her continue on.
One of the things that's really interesting too with that, like how mind-boggling it is that she pursued that path, is then if you learn about her life after the period of this book, and once we get past the 1968 period, she was incredibly vocal about how she thought the movement was a failure and that nothing was ever going to change, and that, I think, ostracized her a bit in some of the public sphere, but she was for a long time very in demand at universities and stuff to talk about her life. There's a quote that I found of hers later on when she's reflecting on things not changing, and it's eerily relevant to today. I'm going to just read it real quick. Hypocrites and saints, the doers and the done too, the rich and poor, Black and white, demonstrator and cop, majority and minority, politician and private citizen, big city and small town, ghetto and suburb, liberal and bigot, clashing values and colliding worlds, the land of explosive confrontations where differences of opinion lead to a fistfight, a bloody shootout, a napalm bombing, slaughter faster than you can think, a land where facts hardly matter, where webs of attitudes, moralizations, and violently defined prejudices are stitched together by slogans, a land where almost all attempts at genuine change is swallowed up and suffocated by the quickness of bureaucracy, where good men are helpless, where the best and the young go mad against the powers that be. And we go from a woman who would not cease to fight, to very quickly saying that there was no hope after 1968 and what came later. And
But
yeah.
But can't you see? I mean, well, I would think with all that she had been through and fighting as hard as she fought, and nothing changed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you use her lens, it was a failure.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, just thinking, growing up, I didn't really know the conditions. I didn't know that I was in a segregated school.
Mm.
Um, my middle school was not segregated. I didn't know any better. My parents shared stories with me about how they grew up. Um, but if I were had I been older in the 60s, I think, and looking back to everything that went on in the 60s and looking at what's happening now, I too might say everything in the 60s was a failure because we shouldn't be having this same fight today. We should not be. And um, I imagine she was extremely discouraged.
Yeah.
Extremely discouraged.
I think even with just thinking about the Voting Rights Act, and in
And
my
why is
time,
it still an act? That's
you know,
that's that's what's bothering
well,
me.
that doesn't even exist anymore. It's out the window thanks to the
Yeah.
Supreme Court. And like, there's something that for many years was pointed to, literally in the textbooks with their bias narrative, like was pointed to as a shining example of progress, and LBJ's
Right.
legacy in part rests on that. And if you watch any of the films about LBJ and all the conflict that he had and how problematic he was with the black leaders of the movement, this was the thing that they actually accomplished. And then whoop, courts just decided no more.
Right.
And then let's
Right.
let the corporations line the pockets of anyone who's running for office, things like that. And
Yep.
that's one thing with history too, that we lose sight of when we're living what's happening.
Yes.
Is that, and if you just look at World War II and the conditions that led up to it, from the end of or from the Great Depression all the way through the 30s, to when the war started in 1939, the conditions that happened, we were seeing this type of crazy change and awful things happening all the time. And the little red flags were going up, the little red flags were going up, and then boom, everything changes on a dime. And for the Voting Rights Act to be taken away,
Right.
after we have the first black president, after there's been progress in certain things and regression in other things, like how things that are unfathomable. I think because we forget about history, we live in complacency and think and take everything for granted. That what progress there, little progress that does exist, and that's a little scary.
And I know that I have said, friends have talked, and they thought this would never happen. Why?
Yeah.
Why would you think that?
Yeah.
It was an act.
Yeah.
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 So
it's making me graduate from stress balls to golf balls.
Uh-oh. Just don't throw them, okay?
No. Oh man. We have a few more minutes, so if anyone has any questions that you'd like us to address, one question that I'll throw out is for a question for Michelle is like in terms of the autobiographical narratives that you've read over time, does this stand out in any way from other narratives, or is this just a very distinct example from the female perspective from this period, and maybe thinking across time and different eras?
I think given her gender and the time in which she wrote it, this really stands out. When I think of uh, Frederick Douglass's slave narratives, when I think of the even some narratives that recent. I'm trying. Oh, I'm real bad with titles. A librarian. I'm very bad with titles.
That's why we know how to look up information. It's good.
The book makes me want to holla. Um, when I think about its Miss Vivian's asking when did she write the book?
Yeah,
It was
finding.
copyright is 1968 in this book, but this book ends, I think, in it was first copyright was 1965. So she probably wrote the book in 63 and 64, maybe.
Mhm.
Um, but um, women were still at a time. This was a time when women were to be seen and not heard. And she tells her story with a boldness. She tells the truth, um, and paints a. I was going to say a beautiful picture, but I mean you can place yourself in the story with her writings, and um, this particular book is, I think, is timeless. The one book that we read, The Miseducation of the Negro, is not timeless.
Mhm.
The some of the things in Frederick Douglass's slave narratives are timeless, but I don't think the book in its entirety is timeless. I think this one is timeless because you don't think that um, if you don't know your history, you don't say, okay, well this was back then. Um, this is just someone's story, and these were the conditions that she grew up in. Um, I and the fact that some colleges and universities are still using it
Mhm.
speaks volumes. I don't know of too many college courses. I think when I was in college, yes, we read Frederick Douglass's um, slave narratives, but I don't know if too many colleges still using
Mhm.
it. Um, I don't know if too many schools still using the miseducation of the Negro.
Yeah.
Most of the books that I read, um, my father made me read. So
My father made me read this one.
did he?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So he had this TMI, but he when he was in college, Anne came to visit his campus, and he was her escort for the whole time, and she
Okay.
stayed in his house, and so he got to get to know her a lot in time, and he wrote a big paper about he visited the area
Okay.
later on, and got to see the fruit the fruit of the lack of progress, basically,
Hmm.
and that was late 80s, and seeing that nothing had really changed. And um, so that that goes to the fact, the what you were saying, and this is our responsibility too, as people with families, and younger people who are mentoring, is we have a responsibility. And my parents they have a large age gap between the two of them, so they actually represent kind of two different generations. So they taught me a lot very distinctly from each other, and then we all have this responsibility, and that's how the books that are the most meaningful in terms of history make it through from generation to generation. It's when
Hmm.
a person says, read this, it's special, it's gonna say something to you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's we because time is finite, we don't say that about everything, right? So it's we
Hmm.
when someone says, you've got to read this, um, and there's someone who you trust, do it. You might not like it,
Right.
but you're going to know that at least there's some connection there for someone that you care about.
Well, and I will say that I'm going to add this because I borrowed it. I'm going to add this to my library.
Oh,
One, because I like to be able to write in and
me too. That's why I buy my own books.
yeah, I hate borrowing the book for this particular program.
Yeah.
Everybody borrow our books.
Yes, please borrow our books.
Get an electronic book. But for me, if I want to make notes in the book, and turn down pages and do all the things a librarian's not supposed to do, I really do devour a book, and I always have to be nice to these books.
One of the things that I enjoy about the reading process is when I annotate and I mark passages and stuff. And to revisit a book, like for me, when I was refreshing for today, I went back and I was revisiting my annotations and the notes and stuff. And like, my reading experience of this was in 4 months into COVID, and like what was going on in my life at that time, and
Right.
and if you do that kind of thing when you read, whether it's taking notes or writing the margins and stuff, for serious readers, at least, the journey of the reading is in and of itself a moment in time in our own journeys. And then with the books that you revisit, that can be really special. Like I have a journal here with my notes from when my book club looked at this last year, and
okay.
that stuff. Yeah. So anywho, reading is the best.
It is. And it's funny because I mentioned that book, The Wake of the Wind. That's one of my all-time favorite books. It's fiction, but I love the book. When I read the last sentence I remember this so vividly. I read the last sentence on the last page and I was in tears. I closed the book. I got up, went to my computer, and it was like 3:00 in the morning. I got up, went to my computer, and bought the book from Amazon. So, and I haven't cracked the copy because I borrowed the book from the library, but I had to have that particular book in my collection.
Yeah.
And you're right. It may be what you're going through at the time. It may be the conditions in your community, in the world. But there's something that sparks something in you when you read a book. And I will say that most of the books that we read for this series sparked something in me. One of the books that we read when O hosted with us, I almost cried on air. So it's like, okay, you're not going to do this. I think that we have read some very good books, and most of them I have purchased. Yeah.
Cool. Well, we're nearing the end of our time. Well, we're past the end of our time, and it's time for us to get some dinner. So we're going to have to leave you all, which we're very sad to do because we've had a delightful conversation. And I will first off thank Michelle for being a wonderful regular host and for allowing me to fill in here. And
no, I'm so glad you filled in. I love
you
having
can
you
flying
on,
solo. And we wish Kyla well, and we know she'll be back with you next month. And thank you, Kyla, for the grace to let me fill in for you. And next month's event in this series is on Tuesday, September 28th at 7 p.m. And the book that we'll be discussing is called In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. It's a relatively recent book from a couple years ago, and it's, and I'm quoting here, a searing account of a harrowing relationship with a charismatic but volatile woman. Each chapter in this wildly inventive memoir is driven by its own narrative trope through which Machado holds her story up to the light, examining it from different angles. And the author, so it is autobiographical. The author is a lesbian Hispanic woman. And there are some tough subjects that she covers in that book, but it's her voice and that book in particular have been really welcome in the literary community and significant in adding to the depth and breadth of the stories that are part of our contemporary fiction, contemporary canon. So that should be a really interesting book. And thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Miss Vivian. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you to everyone else who tuned in. Be well, stay safe, borrow books from the library.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I borrowed mine.
Yes, there you go. Oh, and though we are fine free, everyone, remember, you must still return your books at some point in time. So if you have questions about that, if you got strange things in the mail, just return your books. That's all we need.
Yeah. So that others can borrow them.
Yes, exactly. Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thanks, Nick. Good night.
Bye.